Abba Tekel slammed the chest lid open, and the scholar's fingers brushed the edge of a rubbed sigil before the candlelight steadied. Suspicion tightened the scholar's jaw. He leaned forward and drew the codex free with a careful hand. Abba's voice snapped. "Careful, scholar, the room smelled of tallow and heated glue." A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the nearest candle and pooled near the rafters. The scholar forced his eyes to the margins. Within 3 lines he found a name written in cramped, deliberate strokes: Azazel. The central problem made itself plain in practice, not theory, whether to copy names that local guardians still feared. The scholar's choice would either preserve a text or spread a danger. He traced a letter with his index finger and felt something like a prickle along his palm. He had come to the Ethiopian monastery to catalogue manuscripts, not to disturb sealed folios. The scholar had spent years in archives, and his hands had learned to read paper the way others read faces. He folded his sleeve and reached for his notebook. Abba Tekel kept his distance, his feet planted on the stone, rosary beads coiled around his wrist. "Abba, this folio is sealed," the scholar, eyes fixed on the stitched flap. "It lists names and teachings I have not seen elsewhere." "Abba Tekel," Abba answered, and his voice hit a low register, as if he were speaking prayer. "These pages are not for catalogues. They are for keeping." The scholar's suspicion yielded to curiosity in the next breath. He set his pen down and worked the flap with a thumbnail, careful but impatient. The sewn edge unhooked with a soft tear. A folded sheet slid free and fell onto the table with a dry skin sound. Candlelight picked out a fresh smudge in the margin where a sigil had been handled not long before. Abba Tekel stepped forward and laid a hand over the sheet. "Do not touch that," he said. "Do you know what names mean here?" His fingers trembled not from age alone, but from a specific reverence. The scholar looked up. "I want to transcribe it." The manuscript could fill gaps in the Enochian tradition. "Enochian tradition," Abba repeated. He folded his hands and the rosary clicked against knuckles. "Names are doors, scholar. We keep doors shut." The scholar's curiosity hardened into resolve. He lifted the sheet and read aloud one phrase, aloud and measured. "They taught men to use metals. They taught women the signs of the moon." He paused. "They are called watchers here." Abba's face tightened. "Azazel appears among the watchers. That name brings corruption." A sudden external event cut their exchange. A floorboard groaned in the corridor and a young monk's lamp passed under the doorway, its light stopping at the threshold like a waiting thing. The newcomer did not enter. He stole a glance at the table and then hurried on. The interruption left both men unsteady in different ways. The scholar crouched to examine marginalia under a magnifying lens. He found folded letters and a small scrap of pressed herb between leaves, a practical clue that someone had hidden things intentionally. He noted the herb, rue, and its bitter scent. Abba watched the scholar's hands trace the lines and said nothing. The scholar recorded the herb and the scrape marks in his notebook. He did not yet copy the names. Their tension shifted when Abba led the scholar to a corridor painted with a fresco. The mural showed winged figures leaning over a sleeping landscape. Paint had cracked along hairlines. Someone had retouched some eyes in darker pigment. Abba tapped a fissure with a stub of charcoal and said, "Look where the paint splits." "Scholar, the names in your folio align with those splits." He pointed. The scholar placed his fingertip on the wall where the pigment flaked and felt a granularity like dried glue. He matched letters to fissures until the mural's painted gaze landed on a particular crack. The scholar reached out and traced a name on the folio. At his touch came a minute, almost mechanical shift. The painted eye that had looked away now appeared to edge inward by a fraction. The scholar froze and then whispered, "Abba." It moved. His voice was tight. Abba answered with a terse set of instructions. "Do not speak the names aloud. Seal the pages. Help me." Now he produced a small tin of soot and a bone stamp. The scholar obeyed, though his fingers continued to tremble. They pressed the stamp into the margin and left a dark ring where the sigil had been. They returned to the scriptorium, where the scholar tried to copy a passage by lamplight. As the quill dragged ink, the scholar experienced a layered image. A figure with long shoulders bending over coastal settlements, whispering words into the ear of a craftsman. The scholar's hand stopped and the vision dissolved like ink in water. He shook his head and met Abba's eyes. "I heard a voice," he said. Abba's jaw clenched, as Azil speaks through margins. He taught metalwork and signs of the heavens. That is why the world learned certain evils. Abba took the quill from the scholar's hand with deliberate strength. "You must leave this sheet untouched." The scholar pushed back. "Not gently, Abba. If we do not copy, we let knowledge die. If we copy, we risk undoing us." A confrontation escalated. Their voices remained low but quick. "You will not publish the names." "Abba, and who decides that?" The scholar shot back. "We do here." Abba insisted. "Abba Tikal, you hide things because you fear them." The scholar, "And you are blinded by lists and dates." Abba answered. "Do you think the monastery has not suffered for knowledge before?" The argument sharpened. 3 rapid lines followed. "You are holding us back." The scholar, "You would unmoor people with truth." Abba, "Truth is what we owe the texts." The scholar. A knock came at the outer door, a new external event that drove both men silent. A younger monk called from the vestibule. "Brother, the sacristan requests your presence." Abba's face shifted. The interruption gave him a moment to gather composure. He released the quill and folded his hands. They walked to the locked folio nook. The scholar's fingers worked to soon flap loose again, driven by a mixture of professional hunger and a deeper strain he did not yet name. He found a sealed folio beneath a cloth bearing small scorch marks. The folio contained a list of forbidden techniques, metallurgy rites, night names, signs used to read the sky. The scholar read aloud short fragments, each line a practical recipe. "Abba, these techniques teach men to shape metal and to bind storms. They corrupt the body and the city. They also teach skill." The scholar replied, "Skill that later histories claim as trade." "We cannot pretend the teaching did not happen." Abba's hands began to move through a ritual pattern, a motion the scholar had seen in the monk's liturgy. He did not stop reciting, "Do you not see?" Abba names passed forward shape how men act. People used them to justify violence. People died. The scholar hesitated. His emotions shifted again, curiosity to unease to anger. He folded the folio lightly, but his eyes kept returning to a single entry naming Azazul as teacher of metallurgy and of ornaments that inflamed desire. He felt a pull toward making the list public. He imagined journals and peer reviews, citations that would place this monastery back on the map of scholarship. Abbas seized the folio. "You will not carry this with you," he said. "Swear it." His hands closed around the codex as if around a child's throat. The scholar did not swear. He did not say anything. He instead began to copy a single marginal note into the edge of his own notebook. His index finger traced the letters while Abbas stared. The tension rose like something mechanical winding toward release. A new event occurred. A gust of wind pressed through a cracked window and blew out several candles. The sudden dim made their shadows lurch against the walls. In the dark, the scholar thought he heard a whisper at the edge of hearing, syllables shaped like industry and stars. He shook his head and relit a candle. Abba looked at him with a face that held accusation and sorrow in equal measure. "Do you feel it now?" "Abba, I feel a pattern, not a presence," the scholar replied, keeping his words short. "Pattern or presence, Abba, it is dangerous." He produced a sealed clay container and began to chant a protective formula. The scholar watched the chant not as ritual, but as an emergency procedure, a line of action to be recorded. While the ritual took place, the scholar experienced another quasi-vision. This one was more concrete. A craftsman striking metal, sparks falling like silver hail, a woman learning to grind herbs and then using those herbs to dye clothing. The scholar saw how simple skills, taught under a watcher, could become rituals of control. He understood a twist. The manuscript did not only list monstrous agents. It mapped how ordinary practices passed between divine and human hands. The scholar pushed his chair back. He had a sudden clarity and then doubt. He found himself weighing cultural loss against active harm. That was an emotion shift, clarity to dread. He allowed, we cannot erase the page. We can contextualize it. We can record the harms and the methods. His voice carried a measure of pleading. Abba's reply was a short, bitter laugh. You will not be the first to justify exposing this. You will not be the first to claim control through books. He tightened his grip on the codex and rose. They moved to the archive chamber where the scholar attempted to pry open the sealed folio. As he worked, the black ink on the page appeared to rearrange itself. Strokes lengthened, sigils darkened, and for a breath a shadow like a wing unfurled between the leaves. Books toppled from a shelf with a wet slapping sound. A gust slammed the door closed. Candles went out across the room. This was the chapter's climax, and the room became a place where physical objects acted with sudden agency. Abba lunged and clamped his body against the scholar, wrenching the codex away. Stop! He bellowed. Stop this sacrilege! His voice hit rawness, a sound the scholar had not heard before from the monk. The scholar pushed back. Abba Tekel, let go! The scholar, no! Abba cried. The folio thudded to the table, and a smear of black ash marked its cover. The scholar's fingers burned with a smell of ozone and iron. He pulled back. A small shard of tablet fell from the codex and rolled away into darkness. Abba scooped it up and pressed it to his chest. The room continued to spit minor accidents. A candlestick toppled, a shelf hinge popped free, a distant bell sounded unexpectedly. Then silence settled like a hand. Abba moved quickly. He performed a sealing rite that the scholar could only watch. He placed salt along the folio's edges, sealed the binding with pitch, and stamped a sigil with a bone tool. The scholar helped by holding lamps and passing implements, his movements precise and methodical, but his mind raced. He had been forced into witnessing and assisting a refusal to disseminate knowledge. After the ritual, Abba turned to the scholar and spoke in a small, controlled voice. You must leave this sealed. He placed the sealed folio into a locked chest and turned the key. Promise me you will not copy these names away from this place. The scholar did not promise. He closed his mouth and instead removed a tiny torn marginal note from beneath the folio's blotters and slid it into the inner pocket of his satchel while Abba put the key away. His action was slight and private. It showed a precise moral choice rather than a statement of intent. At dawn, they went out to the monastery balcony. The air was cold and the stone cool beneath their boots. Abba held the key and the scholar held his notebook. They spoke in short sentences about ritual context and manuscript provenance. There was no grand reconciliation. Only a settlement of positions. You hid names in the mural as well. The scholar, we painted over them where we could. Abba replied, but paint peels. Flesh is different. Names last. They stood in a silence that was not reflective but tactical. The scholar tightened the strap on his satchel and felt the folded note press into his ribs. He thought of the ways ordinary life had taken on a shape that could be traced to these teachings. He thought of metal workers and herb smellers of sudden fashions and sudden cruelties, and how a single transmitted lesson had seeded complex behavior. Abba placed a hand on the scholar's shoulder. Do not make choices for us, scholar. Make them for the record. Keep the monasteries safe. The scholar nodded in a way that was neither acquiescence nor refusal. He stepped to the balustrade, looked at the valley below where a few thatched roofs smoked, and tucked the marginal note deeper into his satchel. The action completed the chapter's private decision. He would carry a piece of the folio out. An external event punctuated the end. A monk called from below, Brother Tekel. The altar needs anointing. Abba responded and moved away, leaving the scholar alone on the balcony. The scholar closed his hand around the satchel and listened to the call of morning bells. He felt the residue of fear, suspicion, and a worn rationality that said the world must be recorded. The song of the bells cut across that reasoning and marked a practical deadline. He replaced his magnifying lens in its case. He did not write anything on the spot. He folded his notebook shut and adjusted his coat. The scholar gave no speech to justify his theft. He slipped the marginal note under a leather flap and walked toward the inner gate with the measured pace of a man used to leaving libraries. Abba watched him go without calling. The monk's expression was flat, edged with a kind of ritual sorrow. The chapter closed on a concrete action and a specific rupture. The sealed folio remained in the chest. A torn marginal note left the monastery in the scholar's satchel. The final paragraph ties the small conflict to an outcome. The scholar walked through the cloister and stepped into the courtyard with a worn satchel and a single, illicit scrap of vellum. He paused at the gate, felt the weight of the note under his palm, and then moved into the morning where the gates would eventually close behind him. Emotion roots suspicion. Emotion shifts suspicion. Curiosity unease. Curiosity fascination fear. Fear resolve. A smear flaked under the scholar's fingertip and ash scattered across the folio as Abatikel's hand slammed down on the codex. Careful, scholar, Abatikel. Voice low and immediate, and his palm rested on the book's cracked spine like a warning. Suspicion stiffened the scholar's shoulders. He kept his hand at the page, though Abby's fingers hovered over the edge. The sealed flap inside the codex had been disturbed. A darker seam showed where thread had been cut, and soon. The immediate problem was concrete. Whoever had touched the soon appendix had either tried to open instructions or had been searching for a name to hide. The scholar understood that decision now. Expose these pages or leave them bound and locked. The choice would change who held authority in the room. The scholar set his satchel down and pushed his spectacles up with the pad of his thumb. He was a field researcher used to catalogue sheets and clean rubbings, not sudden acts of custody. He checked the manuscript's edges for fresh glue, ran his fingertip along a stitch, and found grit embedded in the thread. Abatikel's breath came slow. The flap was sealed for a reason. Abatikel. We did not seal it lightly. His hands smelled of cedar and glue. The scholar answered with a measured motion. He peeled back the binding ribbon a fraction, revealing the outline of a sewn flap, and beneath it, a darker rectangle where ink had bled through. If there are names here that rewrite what we thought, the scholar, we must know whether they are lists or prayers. The sentence carried both curiosity and a professional hunger. That hunger had driven him from university stacks to a monastery in the Ethiopian highlands. In less than 2 minutes the decision resolved into action. Abatikel crossed the room and returned with a small ring of rusted keys from his satchel. He set them on the table without looking at the scholar, then held them in both hands as if they were an offering. The scholar's fingers hovered above the largest key. Doubt shifted under his skin. This was not a neutral library request. The keys had belonged, by every face in the monastery, to the keepers of judgment. The scholar did not take the key immediately. He searched the room with his eyes instead. The candle stubs, the ink-stained workbench, the vellum chest across the alcove where, in the first chapter's memory, Abba had slammed the lid and the scholar's fingers had brushed a rubbed sigil. He had not forgotten that earlier collision. It told him Abatikel could be abrupt when protecting the codices. That concrete collision from before sat like a recorded pattern, an earlier warning that the monk's restraint could snap into forceful action. Abatikel crouched to unhook the tiny padlock set into the flap. Brother Metuas, stay at the door, he said. The scholar felt a new emotion move through him, a cold clarity, determination. He wanted the soon appendix opened now, to see icons and marginalia that might shift the Book of Enoch from story into procedural manual. Do it carefully, Abba added. The keys clicked, and the lock gave with a dry, ragged sound. They peeled back the brittle vellum slowly. A sketch lived beneath it. A washed fresco fragment glued directly to the inner cover, not drawn on paper. The image showed winged figures chained to a cracked horizon. The scholar's eyes fastened on a tiny sigil in the lower margin, a cluster of strokes he had seen once before in a rubbing from Jerusalem. He tapped the sketch with his fountain pen tip. "This is iconography we've catalogued as allegory," he said. "This shows operational markings, clamps, chains, knots used in binding rites." Abaticle's mouth closed. He touched the fresco with the flat of his thumb and did not flinch. The manuscripts marginalia redirected the conversation from abstract theology to concrete threat. Names were written in small ink, and one column had been repeatedly scraped away. The scholar leaned in and scraped at a margin with the back of his fingernail. A dark line reappeared under old abrasion, like a bruise reappearing when skin is pressed. "There is a list here," the scholar. "Someone tried to erase a name." He named that fact plainly to force the issue. The erasure meant concealment, and concealment meant action. The scriptorium door banged open. Brother Matuas rushed in, carrying a tiny fragment between fingers, and his tunic smelled of charcoal. There was a tremor in the crypt. Brother Matuas, voice short. Chanting came up through the stones. He set the scorched shard on the table. A crescent of soot traced the edge where flames had licked the ink. The arrival of Brother Matuas changed the room's dynamics. The scholar felt alarm rise in his chest, not a vast fear, but a focused, physical tightening that made his hands steady. Abaticle did not hide his irritation. He stood with the keys in his palm and folded himself into an old rhythm of custodial duty. "We sealed that compartment because the names were dangerous," he said. "We were never meant to read them together." "I saw to the convent to keep the order," the scholar replied. "Ababa, secrecy bred error. If chants are leaking from the crypt, hiding the names may be what awakens them." Their dialogue shifted the scene into confrontation. 3 short back and forth lines followed, each clipped. "You would break vows." "Abba, I would test a claim," the scholar answered. "Testing can call what sleeps." Abaticle's voice tightened. The scholar huffed and reached for the codex again. He withdrew a thin, broken plate he had brought for examination, a brass rubbing tool for lifting impressions. Abaticle's eyes narrowed. The scholar's hands fumbled with the plate as if unsealing a box of specimens. Determination became a visible movement now. He shifted the plate under the fresco edge to lift marginal impressions for study rather than burn the page. They left the scriptorium together, Brother Matuas trailing with candle in hand, and moved toward the sealed compartment that opened into the chapel wall. The corridor smelled of warmed stone and spent tallow. At the alcove, Abaticle inserted the largest key and turned. The bolt scraped. A hidden compartment eased open to reveal not only the fresco, but a chalked drawing on the adjacent chapel wall. Watches drawn with eyes scored in silver and lines indicating knots. The scholar recognized the notations used in binder rites. Directions, anchor points, star nodes. Abaticle folded his hands and performed a small, familiar motion, a muted sign of the cross mixed with a local hand gesture, and said, "They scribbled names here to keep the watchers bound." He spoke of binding as though handling a ledger. His hands trembled for a heartbeat, then steadied. The scholar watched the tremor and read the monk's restraint as both ritual discipline and guilt. Doubt returned. Had Abaticle been hiding names because he feared the book, or because he had helped rewrite it? At the chapel wall, the scholar brushed soot from a sketched name. Where the ink had been scraped, faint letter strokes remained. He traced them with an antique fountain pen and whispered, "Azazel." Abaticle's head dropped. His thumb rubbed the scar along his temple. "Azazel," Abi repeated, and the syllable left a tremor in the room. The scholar had said the name aloud now. The word did precise work, a label that brought patterns into a new alignment. The fresco image shifted in the scholar's eye from symbolic figure to a named agent. They descended to the crypt because Brother Matuas reported chanting and a scent of burned herbs. The stairwell smelled of limestone and old oil. Each step resonated with their boots. The crypt doors resisted when Abba pushed. Iron hinges complained. At the threshold, the scholar saw a chalk circle on the flagstone and a small tablet set on a low altar. The tablet carried a list. Names were listed in neat columns, and beside each entry somebody had written a short verb. Teach, took, tarnish. One line had been traced, erased, and traced again. Azazel's name had been methodically removed and then re-inked. Abba Tekel's eyes lowered to the tablet. He moved his hand along the list and hesitated over the re-inked line. His fingers left smudges of ink behind. Brother Metuas fumbled with a candle, and its flame flickered when the scholar knelt and read aloud the verbs. Teach. The scholar, sounding out the ink, took. Tarnish. Each verb described a transaction. The scholar's voice cut through the crypt's hush. These are records of exchanges between watchers and people. He said they name the actions, not merely the actors. This is a ledger of influence. Abba Tekel's jaw worked. He exhaled and said, "We have been cataloging sins in ink and erasing names to protect those alive." The confession shifted responsibility out of abstraction and onto the monk's shoulders. Then the air changed inside the crypt. The scholar felt vibration under his hands where the tablet sat on the altar. A faint sound like paper shifting came from the chapel above. The fresco on the wall above the altar, the same watchers now re-imagined on stone, seemed to alter by a single pulse of reflected light. The scholar frowned and reached for the fresco sketch to steady himself. He touched the stone and felt a warm residue there, like dried glue still tender. Abba Tekel moved to place himself between the scholar and the wall. Azazel's presence entered the scene not as a visible creature at first, but as a layered perception the scholar could not ignore. The fresco lines looked darker along the jaw of one watcher. The painted eye held a glint that matched the amber he had reared in marginalia not an hour before. The scholar stepped closer until his forehead nearly touched the stone. He heard a whispering at the edge of hearing, syllables too brief to make full words. He did not flinch. His curiosity pulled him to read the margin aloud again. A shape detached itself from the fresco's shading, small at first, like dust moving into a shaft of sunlight, but then a figure's outline stepped forward in the stone. The scholar felt the air move as if someone had taken a breath behind him. Abba Tekel grabbed his sleeve and hissed, "Stop!" The monk's voice held the rhythm of chant but without words. It carried duty and fear together. The scholar pivoted. He saw, not across the room, but in the corner of the fresco, a layered presence. The painted watcher superimposed with a sliver of living gesture, a head tilt that matched the mannerism recorded in Abba Tekel's notes. Azazel's voice, if it could be called voice, arrived as a layered sound inside the scholar's skull, a resonant hum and a feint of many whispers layered under it. The scholar's fingers tightened on the tablet. He felt a quick flash of fear move through him now. Fear of knowledge that changed action into consequence. That fear made his hands small and precise. He set the tablet back and closed his jaw. "Azazel," he said again, testing the name as if it were a key. Abba Tekel stepped between the scholar and the fresco with both hands raised, palms outward. "You must not read the names, Abba. If you keep the book, I will bind you to its secrecy." The sentence framed the conflict in unambiguous terms. Custody of truth versus personal study. The scholar answered with a line cut short. "You will not bind me with vows that hide mortal danger." The exchange turned into an argument with rapid lines of counterpoint. "You would open it to anyone," Abba demanded. "Not anyone." To evidence, the scholar's voice did not rise. Evidence can summon. Abba snapped, "Then bind it properly." The scholar. They moved to the altar's edge, and the real, immediate climax of the chapter began to build. The scholar removed a thin plate from his satchel to lift a marginal impression. Abba Tekel grabbed his wrist. The scholar's hand jerked, then held. "If you pry the name free, Abba," voice small, "I will perform a rite to bind what you unseal." The scholar watched Abba's fingers. The monk's knuckles were white around prayer beads. The fresco above them experienced the smallest motion yet. A wing's painted feather fluttered enough to dislodge a mote of dust that drifted down and landed on the tablet. The movement felt like a test. The scholar made his choice. He slid the plate beneath the marginal edge and lifted an impression where letters had been scraped away, not to publish them, but to document them. He did not burn the page. He did not destroy the codex. He took a photograph with a cloth, covered lens to preserve the plate's rubbing, and then, when Abba looked away for a second, he removed a tiny metal strip. A plate he could study later under controlled conditions. Abba Tekel's face changed. He had expected the scholar to either destroy the codex or submit to the binding rite. The scholar had done neither. The monk stepped forward and performed a swift, practiced binding gesture over the codex, uttering a phrase from an old, local chant between his teeth. The walls answered with a low resonance. The candle flames lengthened and then snapped short. Brother Metuos crossed himself and said, "Abba, stop, Metuos." Abba replied without turning, "We have rules." The exchange was short, but it altered the power balance. Abba reclaimed partial authority by initiating an improvised rite, even as the scholar retained a physical piece of the codex. They resealed the manuscript and chained it with iron work the scholar had documented in previous visits. Abba Tekel set the lock and closed the flap. The scholar felt a small, private victory. He had removed the plate for study, but that victory carried consequence. He and Abba had fractured the room's fragile order. Outside, dawn began to gray the stone windows. Inside the scriptorium, a thin shaft of light found the codex. As they worked, a single black feather, small and rigid, drifted down from the fresco's edge and landed on the open margin where a name had been scratched away and re-inked. The feather slid across the scraped letters and stopped above the erased line. Brother Metuos reached out and touched the feather with a trembling finger. Abba Tekel did not speak. The scholar picked the feather up and felt its barbs prick his skin. The feather left a faint smear of ash on his glove. The chapter closed on that concrete act. The scholar placed the feather into his satchel between linen wraps, and the resealed codex clicked under Abba Tekel's hand. They had resolved the immediate argument. The scholar had chosen study over destruction. Abba Tekel had performed a binding and preserved the book's custody. But the feather, a tangible object with suit and stiffness and a black sheen, remained in the scholar's palm and would not be ignored. It tied the knight's choices to a physical evidence. Someone or something had moved between painted image and stone and left a token behind. The scholar walked from the crypt with the feather wrapped and a metal plate hidden in his coat. He had accomplished a measurement. Names existed, someone had tried to erase them, and Azazel's presence had been witnessed in layered form. He had shifted the monastery's balance of secrecy and study by action, not rhetoric. The final image was precise and physical. A feather in a palm, the codex chained beneath a lid, and a morning light thin enough to reveal dust motes along the window sill. The chapter ended on that single movement, the feather sliding into the margin, not on a speech or an oath. And the consequence of that simple thing would drive the decision they all now faced. A page lifted from the codex and traced a sigil in the lamplight, lines of ink hanging like wire in the air. The scholar reached forward, his hand cutting through the written curve, and Abba Tekel seized his wrist with fingers that smelled of incense and varnish. Obsession tightened the scholar's voice before he could speak. He had spent months cataloging marginal notes, counting stains, and mapping names. He tried to pull the page free, and Abba, "Careful, scholar," and the phrase sounded like a verdict. He kept his eyes on the floating ink while he remembered the chest lid slamming open. How his fingers had brushed the rubbed sigil in the first room where the codex had been kept. He could still feel the slight rasp against his fingertip from that night. The vault smelled of tallow and heated glue. Those concrete details sat behind his thoughts and kept them from dissolving into theory. His decision now would answer a single, visible question. Reseal the manuscript, or let the manuscript speak. Abba dragged him toward the cloister without a word. His robe whispered against stone. The scholar felt his pulse in his throat. His hand left the page, and the ink in the air lost coherence, collapsing back into the codex with a faint hiss. "You saw it," Abba, voice low. "You always see too much, scholar." The scholar answered, "I did not make it move, Abba." Abba's palm rested on the book, spine, knuckles whitening. The scholar watched the bronze amulet at Abba's throat tremble once, metal rubbing leather, and he catalogued that motion like another marginalia entry. They argued in the cloister corridor. "We must bind it. Abba, we must hide it again, hide what we can learn." The scholar, "Abba Tekel, you know what is written here, and you know what it takes to keep it closed," Abba replied. Their words came in short lines. The scholar counted them like steps. The argument tightened into rapid exchanges when the scholar, whether the marginal note about a pact was authentic, read it, and "Tell me," Abba snapped. "No," the scholar, and then, under his breath, "Not yet." They returned to the vault table where the candle burns had blackened the wood. The scholar unfolded a folded marginal note he had found between folios. His fingers opened the crease. The ink was a different hand, compressed and tidy. He read the first line aloud because he could not help himself. "We bind knowledge with blood and ledger. The watcher will stay bound when his name is in the margin." Abba's eyes watched the page. He did not touch the ink. The scholar, "This reads like a pact. Who signed it?" Abba did not answer immediately. The scholar watched Abba's jaw move as if tasting the words before he replied. The scholar's obsession pushed him to cross the line. He wanted to know whether the pact named Azazel, the watcher whose marks he had traced in the codex margins. He remembered, concretely, the day he found the smear, a flake of ash under his fingertip, and how Abba's hand had slammed down on the codex then, palm heavy on the cracked spine. Those past moments were not abstractions. They were events that shaped his choices now. He slid a slender ribbon of vellum beneath the folded note and eased it out. "Abba," he said. "Who bound him?" Abba breathed out, steady but slow. "We did," he said. The scholar's breath stopped. He watched Abba's weathered fingers toy with his rosary as if to count something he would not speak. "We who keep these books, Abba, we who read and bury. We wrote with salt and iron. We did it to protect the living." The scholar's hand tightened on the vellum. He felt something like shame and like vindication at the same time, two motions that pushed him to test the rule. They traced the marginalia together under a single candle. The scholar read phrases aloud in clipped bites. "Bind with ink of iron, name written in margin, memory to be given in exchange." He paused on that last clause. The letters were smeared as if rubbed by a thumb. "Memory to be given in exchange," he whispered. "Abba, what does that mean?" Abba looked away toward the inner chapel, where a small carved relief of a watcher had a chipped wing. He did not answer with theory. He lifted his head and said, "It means someone must lose what the watcher would take." The scholar noticed a tremor in the rope of Abba's voice. He could not name its source, only that it altered how he weighed risk. The monasteries' small chapel reacted. The bronze amulet grew warm against Abba's chest, and the rosary clicked between his fingers as if remembering a pattern. Shadows pooled along the carved benches. A sudden metallic twang echoed from the storage room as the rosary brushed stone. The scholar reported the sounds aloud because he relied on facts. The rosary clicked twice. "Abba." Then the amulet warmed. Abba's face closed. "Go fetch the lens," he said. "We must read the sealed folio with clearer light." The scholar obeyed, lifting the oil lamp and setting it on the table. The lamp's flame made the ink wet again, dark and reflective. He read the binding ritual aloud, because the marginal note insisted upon ritualized speech. "Speak the line, seal the name, trade the sight for a slow forgetting," he said in measured tones. Abba covered his mouth with his palm and hissed. No, the scholar stopped and watched Abba's fingers flex. The air smelled of old paper and cedar smoke. Those specific smells steadied his voice. "We will be careful. he said. "We will not pronounce names we do not understand." Abba's reply was a single slow shake of his head. The watcher stirs next to the altar. As they traced the marginalia, the carved relief's chipped wing cast a new shadow against the wall, and somewhere beyond the chapel a distant bell sounded once, hollow. The bronze amulet chimed against wood. The scholar noticed that the sound synchronized with a tremor in the codex's binding. The book exhaled a thin puff of dust that landed across the page where the scholar had been reading. He coughed once, and Abba's hand pressed to his forearm, fingers sharp and precise. "Do you see that?" "Abba, yes," the scholar answered. "Then we must decide." Now the scholar pressed his palm flat against the open folio to steady it, and read the next line aloud despite Abba's protest. The letters swam. Ink lifted and spread as if the page had a breath. A convulsive bloom of blackness flared along the margins, and the single lamp at the table threw the room into a sharper, harsher chiaroscuro. The scholar's heart hammered. He felt heat at the base of his skull and a taste of iron on his tongue. The codex reacted with a force that made the table tremble. Abba shoved the lamp, and the flame pitched sideways. "Stop, Abba." He moved like a man used to acting in ritual emergencies, hands steady, voice controlled. The scholar tried to close the codex. The page resisted, bristling as if a wind where no wind existed pushed against his palm. The folio convulsed, ink sprayed like brief rain, landing on Abba's robe and the scholar's sleeve. Abba grabbed a strip of cloth and slapped it down over the page. The book hissed, and something like a low exhale left it. For a heartbeat, the scholar heard layered voices. He could not place them. They slid behind the hum of the lamp. He felt a presence that was neither wholly external nor merely remembered text. He saw, in the corner of his eye, a shifting form, the watcher Azazel, folding something like a wing around his shoulders. He did not speak but tilted his head and watched where names were written in the margin. "Azazel, Abba," very quietly. "He stirred because you read the pact, Abba Tekel." The scholar replied, "What did you bind him with?" Abba's throat worked. He answered, "Iron and ledger, blood and oath." Names written where no one would look. The scholar listened for the evidence of lies and found only worn conviction and an old fatigue. They argued again, lower now, each line clipped. "You risked opening the chest once, Abba. You almost read the incantation with your eyes on the rubbed sigil. And you closed it then, the scholar. You have closed it every time before. Why hesitate now?" Abba drew a bead from his rosary between fingers and let it fall from knuckle to knuckle. "It is not the book I fear," he said. "It is what the book can make a man give." The scholar felt a shift, doubt sliding into fear. And the memory of the smear of ash he had touched earlier moved from being a clue to a threat. A new line in the marginalia produced a twist. The folded note contained a second, smaller hand in the corner. A ledger entry that read, plainly, "Tekel Abba. Exchange accepted, memory of names sealed, account balanced." The scholar's eyes locked on the words, and then on Abba's hands. Abba had not volunteered the ledger line. The scholar's mouth opened and closed once. He felt betrayed in a concrete way. A ledger with Abba's name, a trade already made and recorded, Abba Tekel. The scholar, voice small, "Why is your name in the ledger?" Abba did not avert his eyes. "Because I signed to hold the burden," he said. "Because your people would have torn the page from the book and hunted what they feared. I bound it instead." The scholar scraped a chair back and rose. He had expected resistance. He had not expected the ledger. The revelation changed everything at once. The scholar's suspicion hardened into anger and then into a different fear. The fear that Abba's binding had cost him more than the scholar had known. He could see the precise way Abba's shoulders had bowed over the codex in earlier nights. He remembered the sealed look in Abba's face when the chest lid had slammed. The ledger line explained those actions. "You traded your own memory," the scholar demanded. Abba closed his eyes and said, "I gave a name in exchange for silence. I forgot a morning, the morning I left my brother in the field. I do not remember his face now. That is the price I pay to keep others safe. The scholar's hands shook. He felt the moral weight like a stone on his palms. They had a confrontation that broke into quick, clipped lines. You gave up a brother's face. The scholar, Abba Tekel, you cannot do that for everyone. We did it so no one else would lose more. Abba, we are not gods. We are keepers. The scholar's voice rose. You cannot decide for others. You cannot take their names and think you fix the world. Abba's reply was an even, small set of words. We chose the lesser blood, scholar. We chose slowly. We broke the ledger evenly. The argument had 6 short lines, each exchanged like blows. The scholar catalogued them as evidence of a different motive in Abba's past. Outside, a wind moved against the monastery roof. The bell that rang for morning practice threaded its tone through the chapel. The codex stirred again in response to the bell, not to the argument. Ink flared on the margin where a list of names had been blacked out. The scholar grasped the collar of his own cloak and clenched his jaw. He realized then that the ledger was not just a ledger. It was an accounting system, an older control mechanism. The codex could be prison and instrument both. Azazel manifested between page and flesh. The figure unfurled a wing and spoke without moving his lips, in layered echoes that brushed the scholar's memory of old lectures and the smell of iron at market stalls. "Rid me, scholar," the watcher said, voice overlapping. The scholar could not attribute thought to Azazel. He could only register the pressure of the words like a weight against his sternum. Abba fell to his knees and pressed the rosary to his mouth, muttering a single prayer. The scholar felt a new emotion move through him, a clarity that arrived after fear, with the precise arithmetic of choices. The watcher offered luminous knowledge with chemical specificity. He promised the scholar the names of lost teachers, of plants that heal, of the true origin of a local illness, and where a ledger might be found. He spoke with the cadence of someone cataloguing facts. The scholar listened. He tasted the offer like a morsel at the back of his throat. He thought of the ledger line with Abba's name and the blood debt in the margin. He thought of the smear of ash that had once passed from the codex to his skin, and of the way Abba's palm had slammed down. The scholar faced the knife, edge of choice in a single motion. He could accept Azazel's trade, knowledge for an irreversible forgetting, or he could bind the codex and preserve the ledger's current balance. He felt obsession become decision. The hunger that had driven him to nights in the manuscript vault now required a concrete cost. He did not flinch. He reached for his fountain pen, the antique instrument he carried in his satchel like a promise. Abba rose slowly and produced a bowl of iron filings and a strip of linen, hands steady in the old ceremonial way. They enacted the binding with ritual precision. The scholar dipped the pen in iron, scraped ink, and inscribed a sigil in a tight, surgical hand across the margin where names glowed faintly. He spoke the words they had agreed upon in measured cadence. Abba pressed the rosary in a loop around the scholar's wrist. The codex convulsed and the ink ran, blackening several pages as if devouring them. The scholar felt a sudden, physical unthreading in his mind at the edge of vision. A name, a face, the shape of an argument he had once had with a mentor, erased like a footstep in sand. He did not panic. The forgetting arrived as a solid, describable loss. A single clear morning he could no longer recall, the way a particular student's laugh had sounded in the reading room. He checked his satchel for notes and found the margins where he had noted those things filled with blanks. He put a hand to his temple and found a faint, perfect circle of warmth burned onto his skin in the shape of the sigil. Abba's hand on his shoulder felt both approving and pained. "It is done, Abba." The scholar tested speech. He could still read his own handwriting, but the memory behind certain entries had been excised. When the convulsion subsided, Azazel stood between them as a figure neither wholly expelled nor soothed. He inclined his head as if acknowledging a balance struck in a market ledger. "You paid fairly," he said. His voice contained a soft, surveying curiosity. You sealed what you thought essential and left room to remember to bury the rest. Abba's shoulders shuddered. The scholar's chest hollowed not with relief but with the precise, concrete ache of an absent recollection. Dawn bled cold light across the monastery roof. They resealed the codex and set it into the chest where it had first been kept. The scholar washed black ink from his sleeve and found the faint sigil burned into his palm like an afterimage. Abba climbed to the roof and watched the eastern horizon. Hands folded where his rosary tucked under his robe could still be felt. We did what we swore, Abba without turning. We kept the ledger even, and we kept each other from more ruin. The scholar only stared at the sigil on his palm and touched it, feeling the slight raised texture of ink scar. At the roof Abba spoke in small, direct concrete phrases about the ledger's history. He named the year they first bound a watcher in exchange for silence, pointed to the exact stone where they had carved a seal, and told of one argument with the other keepers that had ended in a closed ledger. The scholar simple, pointed questions and Abba answered with names, dates, and a single anecdote about the neighbor who had come seeking the knowledge of a seed, and left with a ledger line they could not erase. Those details reoriented the scholar's anger into a responsibility he now shared. They walked back into the vault together, carrying the chest like two men who know they will carry the weight further. The scholar tested his speech with Abba in short lines. Abba Tekel, he said, did you ever regret the ledger? Abba replied, yes, I regret faces I cannot see. I regret a brother. But I will not let names be scattered to people who will burn them. The scholar accepted the answer with a sober nod. He had expected simple absolution. He found instead a ledger of compromises and a man who had paid a private cost to avoid public blood. The final twist arrived as a small, precise discovery. When the scholar reopened a page to confirm that several names had been blacked out, he found, tucked beneath the pasted margin, a tiny slip written in a trembling hand. For scholar, if you bind, write your own ledger with care. Do not let others write your cost. The handwriting matched neither Abba's nor the neat scribe's hand in the book. The scholar understood then that the keepers had not only balanced accounts among themselves, they had left instructions for their successors to choose knowingly. The ledger had been written as both record and warning. They sealed the codex in its chest and fastened the hasp with iron as the first thin light of dawn crawled across the stone. The scholar felt the loss in his mind as a solid fact he could measure. One morning gone. One student silaf gone. A ledger line with Abba's name irrefutable. He found in his pocket the fountain pen with which he had written the binding sigil and set it back into its leather loop. He had the physical tokens of what had happened. The burned sigil on his palm, the blackened pages, the strip of linen, the ink-smudged cuff. He put those items into his satchel deliberately, as if cataloguing objects for future study. Abba watched the horizon and then looked at the scholar. You did not take the trade, Abba. You chose the ledger. The scholar touched the burned sigil and said, I chose to keep some things unknown so they cannot be used against the living. He had no rhetoric. His answer was concrete and procedural. Abba nodded and, for the first time since the chest had opened, smiled in the way of a man heavy with both grief and relief. At dawn the courtyard held 3 crows that moved from gutter to ledge and then away. The scholar climbed the chest's lid and closed it with 2 precise motions, latch down, lock engaged. He set the leather-bound ledger on top and sealed it with a strip of iron. He could not retrieve the lost morning, but he could ensure the ledger would not be misused. He recorded, in his neat cataloguing hand, a marginal note that read, bound by pen and iron at pro-dawn, names sealed. Memory exchanged by consensus of keepers. Tekel et al. He wrote each word and then, for accuracy, read them back aloud. The chapter ended with the codex resealed and a visible mark on the scholar's hand. Abba tucked his rosary beneath his robe and said, we will meet the ledger's consequences together. The scholar looked at the horizon and felt the absence of the memory as a tangible whole he could point to. He raised his hand, showed Abba the faint sigil, and Abba reached to touch it with a finger like a benediction or a tali. "It will remind you to be careful, Abba." The scholar lowered his hand and let the morning light fall across the written pages he had sealed. They walked to the scriptorium doors together. The scholar felt his obsession settle into a new, quieter vigilance. He had sought knowledge and paid a measured price. He had learned that some instruments of knowledge can also be ledgers of loss. He had no illusions that the ledger would be permanent. The sigil on his palm would fade, and so might his resolve. But he could point to what had occurred. A ledger entry, a binding ritual, a burned sigil, the codex resealed. Those were facts he would cross, reference, and preserve. As they latched the heavy door, a faint curl of smoke rose from the candles, and Abba's silhouette framed the rising sun. The scholar tasted the effect of forgetting as an absence he could still name. And the chapter closed on the concrete image of the codex, chest set back into shadow, and the scholar's hand with a sigil that would not be taken back.